So we've made it to the Civil War. Now here's the thing. We have the North and the South in what is now the United States. And the North and the South keep arguing. They can't compromise on everything. And so because of this, they're going to have a war. And the South is going to start to want to come away from the United States. They want to break free of the United States and become their own country. This war that we're going to talk about is a war some of you may have heard of called the Civil War. Okay, so why were the North and the South fighting? Well, one of the biggest things they were fighting about was slavery. The North did not want slavery, and the South did want slavery. The North had factories, and the factories didn't need slave help because they were workers that came in. They paid their workers, and they went home. The plantations, on the other hand, were huge. Do you remember about plantations when we were talking about the 13 colonies? They were these huge, huge farms. They were almost like mini cities. And they were so big that they needed a lot of workers. Well, if they paid that many workers, they would make no money. So they would get slaves. They would purchase slaves. I know that sounds horrible, but that is definitely what they did. They would purchase the slaves. The slaves would work for them for free because they were like you bought a machine. Like you buy the machine and the machine does the work. Well, they bought people kind of like a machine. They bought the person and then they would do the work. Now they would feed them and they would house them, but it was not nice, beautiful houses with nice, yummy food. It was the bare minimum, and they tended to be quite mean to their slaves. Not all people were mean to their slaves. Some people treated their slaves fairly. Was rare, but it did happen. The states that had slaves were called slave states. Makes sense. The states that had no slaves were called free states because people in these states were free from slavery. Now, in a free state, it was against the law to have slaves. In a slave state, you were allowed to obviously have slaves. Now, a lot of the slave states, though, had people who still did not want slaves, but they didn't want to move. So they would try to help out the slaves. They actually tried to move them from the slave states to the free states in secret. Now, if you were caught trying to help slaves, you would get in big trouble. And also, if your slave actually got free somehow, like ran away, there would be rewards for trying to find the slave. People would pay big money for those slaves that got free. Now, one of the things Congress was doing was trying to keep it so that there were the same amount of free states and the same amount of slave states. But every time that they brought in a new state, they would have to decide, was this going to be a free state or was this going to be a slave state? Well, something happened. At one point, they didn't know what to do. Maine and Missouri both tried to get into become states. And so they had to decide, were Maine and Missouri going to be free states or were they going to be slave states? So Maine became a free state. It is in the north, so it kind of made sense. But Missouri kind of sits in the middle. And they decided Missouri was going to become a slave state based on the fact that it had to be equal states of either kind. People in Missouri did not agree with this, and they became very upset. So a compromise, which was one of your vocabulary words a while back in spelling and vocabulary, was made, which was called the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise said that at that point where Missouri became a slave state, anything above Missouri would always become a free state, and anything from Missouri down would become a slave state. So it wasn't based on how many slave states and how many free states. It was based on this dividing line across our country. The Southerners were not totally happy with this decision. They decided that every state should get to choose what they want to do. Because of this, they actually wanted to separate themselves from the Union. They wanted to separate from the North. The North was not happy about this. They said that no state should be able to leave the Union, the United States of America. The Southerners, on the other hand, wanted to fight for their independence from the Union. Now we come into time where a very famous president comes in. President Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln understood the problems that were happening right then and there, where people wanted to leave the Union. Abraham Lincoln did not like slavery. Because of this, the people in the South did not want Abraham Lincoln as their president. They wanted to leave the Union so that they could have their own ways and get their own president to the office. So the state of South Carolina was the first state to actually leave the Union. Shortly after that, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also left the Union to become their own, what they thought would become a country. They called it the Confederate States of America. So we have the United States now in the north, and we have now the Confederate States of America in the south, the states that wanted to have slavery. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Abraham Lincoln was not happy. He was actually very sad. He did not want the separation of his country. He didn't want the South and the North to become enemies, but they kind of already had.